Good morning, everyone, and good evening to folks in the US. Welcome to the webinar hosted by the Japan Institute of International Affairs. Japan Institute of International Affairs is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank based in Japan. And we are delighted to have you with us today. Today's topic is economic statecraft and economic sanctions, a very timely topic, I may say, if I may say. And we are extremely fortunate to have Dr. Daniel Drezner from Tufts University as our speaker today, because he is widely known as one of the most eminent scholars on this topic. So let me briefly introduce our speaker, Dr. Daniel Drezner. Dr. Drezner is a professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University in the US. He has a PhD from Stanford University, and he has been teaching and researching at Tufts University for many years. He's a very prolific writer, and I cannot even begin to enumerate all his major works, but the Sanctions Paradox, one of his earlier works, is a milestone in the study of economic sanctions. And also he has written many books and articles since then. The most memorable ones I remember are All Politics is Global, explaining international regulatory regimes, and the Theories of International Politics and Zombies, a very cute title. Also, we have Dr. Masako Suginohara as our discussant. She's a professor at Ferris University in Yokohama, and she's an expert on international political economy. She's been with our research group on economic security linkages. Today, Dr. Drezner is going to speak about half an hour, and Dr. Suginohara will make some comments on his presentation. And after letting him respond to her comments, we'll open the floor for questions. Please input all your questions in the QA box. Not in the chat. Also, we are providing simultaneous translation for your convenience. So please follow the instructions that were posted on the screen before we started. Okay, so Dr. Drezner is going to speak about half an hour, and the topic, the title of the talk is How Not to Sanction. So the floor is yours, Dan.
Thank you very much, Kisuke. I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully this will work. Please let me know if it works. I think it's working, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much to JIIA for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak with you. My talk today is based off of an article that is forthcoming in International Affairs from a special issue that I'm co-editing with Rita Narlikar from JIIA based in Hamburg, called, colloquially enough, International Relations, the How Not To Guide. Which covers various facets of foreign policy and international relations, looking at more catastrophic episodes to figure out how to learn lessons. but I've tried to adapt it for this audience in terms of a more general outlook in terms of sanctioning. It would be safe to say that sanctions are a popular policy tool over the last 20 years and certainly the last decade, with increasing use over time. And this year in particular, there has been a rather robust use of economic statecraft, particularly towards Russia after that country invaded Ukraine 2 months ago. This slide, which is from the General Government Accountability Office in the United States, demonstrates that the United States has sanctioned a significant number or significant fraction of countries. These are just the countries that the US currently has sanctions on. It obviously does not include those that previously had sanctions imposed on them, nor does it include countries like China, where there have been individuals that have been put on a sanctions list of one kind or another. So one of the other innovations in terms of sanctions has been the expansion of them, not just to target entire economies, but rather to target specific sectors, or in some cases, particular individuals accused of malfeasance or human rights abuse or corruption or narcotics trafficking. And I would add that it is hardly just the United States. While the United States has been the most enthusiastic proponent of economic sanctions, this is actually a policy tool that has been increasingly embraced by both great powers and middle powers alike. China has become increasingly active in its use of economic statecraft. It does it in a somewhat different way than the United States, but is nonetheless increasingly over time been willing to try to flex its economic muscles as a way to achieve foreign policy goals. Russia has been sanctioning countries ever since the Russian Federation came into existence in 1991. It has been particularly keen in sanctioning other states in the former Soviet Union. And indeed, one of the reasons why Russia's in the situation it is in Ukraine right now is precisely because its economic statecraft against Ukraine failed back in 2013, when that country eventually decided to join the European Union's Eastern Association Agreement. And even middle power countries like Saudi Arabia have become more active in terms of sanctioning. In the last few years, Saudi Arabia has sanctioned Yemen, it's sanctioned leaders in Lebanon, and it's also sanctioned Qatar through the Gulf Cooperation Council. What is puzzling about this is that it is safe to say that sanctions do not have the best track record. If you take a look at the large statistical data sets, whether from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the threat and imposition, the TIES data set, the threat and imposition of economic sanctions data set that is collected by a bunch of scholars primarily based in North Carolina, or the Global Sanctions Database, which recently came online, I think sometime in the last 12 months, all of them show the same thing, which is that sanctions at best work maybe 1 out of 2 times, and even there, that sort of defines success in terms of yielding concessions in a very capacious way. And some scholars are far more pessimistic, saying they only work something like 5% of the time. And the other thing that is impossible to escape when you talk about economic statecraft is the high-profile failures that have occurred. Think of the United States embargo of Cuba once Fidel Castro took power in 1961, or both the pre-Gulf War sanctions and then the post-Gulf War sanctions against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, neither of which really accomplished their stated goals. Or think about the Iran sanctions that were put in place or reimposed by President Trump beginning in, I believe, 2018. In none of these cases, and even though these sanctions all impose significant costs on the target did not necessarily make any significant concessions. So the puzzle is why you see so many sanctions episodes with such limited success. And to apologize for the self-promotion, it is almost paradoxical. It is the paradox that it seems like countries seem to sanction or impose sanctions in precisely those situations when they don't seem to work terribly well. So the argument I'm going to make is that the reason we see a growth of sanctions is there are a number of reasons for this, but the primary one is that it's not that sanctions are necessarily the best policy tool out there. It's that they are the policy tool preferred compared to all the other alternative options. Or to paraphrase Winston Churchill, sanctions are a lousy, rotten way of trying to coerce other countries until you consider the alternatives. At the same time, particularly compared to other policy tools, the technology of sanctions has undeniably improved, which means to say that the ability of particular countries to impose sanctions and to threaten them has been done so in such a way to increase the cost to the target in such a way that you would expect them to potentially succeed more. What has not changed, however, is the politics of economic statecraft. And there are certain things where I think particularly the United States has been more enthusiastic in terms of imposing sanctions, believing that they are more likely to work because they reduce the definition of success to whether you can impose significant costs, without realizing that economic costs are only one factor among many in terms of determining when a target government will decide to acquiesce in terms of sanctions. And so one of the arguments I'm going to make is that we need to learn from the sort of failures that have been particularly high profile. And admittedly, these failures are not necessarily typical, a part of a typical sanctions episode, but they highlight the dangers that an unthinking approach to economic sanctions will lead to, in that it can cause significant humanitarian costs and significant political blowback without actually necessarily accomplishing their objective. And when thinking about sanctions with respect to Russia, we are beginning to enter some dangerous territory where we might need to consider alternative options. So this talk will proceed by first me explaining why sanctions are so popular. Then I will categorize the various purposes that economic sanctions have been employed for. I will explain the sort of conditions that lead to their relative success or failure. I will sort of describe their evolution with a minor emphasis on Iran and Iraq, and then I'll discuss where we can go from here. So there are three reasons why sanctions are an increasingly popular policy tool. The first is globalization, which is to say that you really can't successfully impose economic sanctions unless there is a somewhat integrated global economy, because you have to actually have some economic exchange to be able to disrupt. The second reason is the increasing political cost of alternatives to economic sanctions. And the third is the politics, particularly in the United States, of why sanctions are considered so appealing. So first, in terms of globalization, despite reports of globalization now coming to an end, of course, if you take a look at sort of the raw data on this, it suggests that the global economy remains reasonably closely integrated. And so therefore, the ability of any one government to disrupt economic exchange, if they can do so, would represent a particular shock. And this is particularly true of the United States because both of its large market size and its centrality in key economic networks. So if the United States imposes sanctions, particularly with the cooperation of key allies, that can impose significant costs on any state that has any sort of investment in being part of the global economy. Equally important from the US perspective in particular, although I think this is not just the United States, is the declining appeal of policy alternatives, which is to say, if economic sanctions are a means of coercion, there are other ways in which you can presumably try to alter target behavior. One is, instead of using economic coercion, is to use force, is to use military statecraft. Another possibility is, rather than using economic coercion, is to use economic inducements or carrots instead of sticks. The problem is, at least in the United States, neither the use of force nor economic inducements are politically popular right now. In terms of military statecraft, it would be safe to say the United States is somewhat weary, particularly of the direct use of US military force because of what has happened in Iraq and most particularly Afghanistan. Ukraine represents a potential partial exception to this, although this is really the shipment of arms rather than actual US forces. And indeed, that is the bright red line that the Biden administration has drawn with respect to what will happen going forward in Ukraine. And at the same time, the political appeal within the United States for trade agreements or other forms of inducements has unfortunately dissipated. And we saw that with I think the death knell for that was the Trump administration's decision to withdraw immediately from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the Biden administration really, in terms of trade, is unfortunately represents continuity with the Trump administration before it in terms of a moratorium on any new trade agreements. So in the absence of trade deals or economic aid or the use of force, sanctions is sort of the primary policy tool remaining. And indeed, it has legitimately become the policy option of first resort. This is something I argued in a foreign affairs essay that I published that came out in August of last year. And interestingly enough, it was also a phrase used by the US Treasury Department in their 2021 sanctions review, which came out a couple of months later. That essentially, if there is any particular foreign policy reverse or crisis in the world, the United States will first respond with sanctions. And politically, particularly for Congress, but also for the executive branch, there is a political appeal to sanctions in the following sense. Congress in particular does not traditionally have a lot of tools when it comes to foreign policy, even though constitutionally they do. They have abrogated or delegated most of those powers to the executive branch. And they are reluctant to use some of them. The use of force for Congress is one of those possibilities that is too hot. Members of Congress don't want to take personal political responsibility for advocating going to war. At the same time, sense of the Congress resolutions with respect to foreign policy or diplomatic censure are viewed as too weak. They're insignificant. And so in that sense, much like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, economic sanctions is viewed as the perfect policy tool because it sends a measure of seriousness if you're a member of Congress without necessarily, risking a further conflagration. And so as a result, for members of Congress, they love voting for sanctions because voting for sanctions is a way to demonstrate foreign policy seriousness without too much responsibility for what happens as a result. Now, in terms of the means or the purpose through of which economic sanctions are employed, there tend to be three categories here. One is the use of sanctions as a form of denial, preventing the target from doing what it very much wants to do without making it change its mind. A second possibility is to deter anticipated actions, much in the same way that military deterrence exists. And then the third and most popular way in which sanctions are used is as a tool of coercion or compellence to get an actor to reverse a decision or a policy that it has made. Now, when it comes to denial, the truth is that most forms of economic statecraft aren't going to work terribly well. In order to deny an actor from doing what they want to do, you have to have truly comprehensive, multilateral cooperation, which is extremely difficult to cobble together. Furthermore, and this is a fundamental fact about economic sanctions, particularly sanctions if you're trying to restrict trade, is that economic sanctions outlaw what would otherwise be considered ordinary market activity. And so particularly if you impose trade sanctions, you are increasing the incentive for private sector actors or for black marketeers to bust the sanctions. It increases their profitability of doing so. So anytime you tend to impose trade sanctions, you are almost automatically creating a heightened incentive for some actors to violate the sanctions. Furthermore, very often the target can find substitutes. So one example that was an attempted denial was the arms embargo placed on South Africa when that government was an apartheid regime. South Africa responded to that by essentially developing their own weapons industry. And similarly, Israel did something similar in response to the Arab embargo. The only exception to when denial can work as a tool of economic sanctions is if you are imposing some sort of embargo involving monopsony suppliers. In other words, only a very few countries or a very few producers can supply things. This exists with respect to high-tech military goods, and increasingly, as we're discovering, it also exists with respect to semiconductors, which is to say that there are only so many firms that can actually make particular semiconductors, and that's why that sanction in particular of Russia going forward will wind up being particularly damaging to the Russian economy. As for deterrence, so the theory here is that even if you don't necessarily successfully coerce an actor today, if they do something that is considered a violation of norms or contrary to your interests, let's say a country involved in developing nuclear weapons or violations of territorial sovereignty, a powerful sanction today can signal when they are likely to be used in the future. And so therefore, even if sanctions fail to compel immediately, they can deter future actions. And you can see this clearly at work in terms of the coalition to sanction Russia in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, particularly because it has to be clear that China is looking at this and therefore wondering what would happen if they were to choose to use military force to try to force Taiwan to reunify with the mainland. If it turns out that they had underestimated the costs of that in terms of economic sanctions, it might prevent them from using military force when they otherwise would. And indeed, this in some ways is how one of the key ways in which international norms exist, which is to say, it's not that if an international norm exists and is relatively robust, it's never violated. It might be violated. But the idea is that if it is violated, it automatically triggers sanctioning behavior, whether moral sanctions or material ones. Now, the question is, does this actually work? And the problem here is that it's extremely difficult to prove this, because to prove deterrence, you have to demonstrate a persuasive counterfactual that in the absence of sanctions, an actor would have chosen otherwise to do something. There is research in the literature that suggests there is some supporting evidence showing deterrence has played a role, sanctions deterrence has played a role, both in preventing nuclear proliferation as well as human rights abuses. But again, it remains somewhat speculative, but the evidence is at least somewhat there. It is also unlikely to work on great powers for reasons that I will articulate a bit later. Now, when we talk about coercion, it's also worth realizing that the act of coercing countries can happen through multiple pathways. In other words, there are multiple theories of the case when we talk about how sanctions can work. One obvious way is that if we assume countries function like unitary rational actors, that if you impose a sanction, a foreign policy leader will, adjust their cost-benefit calculations and decide it's not worth pursuing this policy because the sanctions are so costly, I will therefore acquiesce. But there are other ways through which sanctions can work. One is that if there is a particular interest group based in that country that has, that benefits considerably from the economic relationship, they might put pressure on the target regime to change their mind. Or it could be a case that countries don't want to be isolated in the world, regardless of economic reasons, but even socially. So there's evidence, for example, that one source of pressure on South Africa on the apartheid regime to end that regime was not just the economic sanctions, but actually the sports embargo. That South Africa couldn't participate in the Olympics or the World Cup or what have you. Another way is that if sanctions are sufficiently punishing, it's not that the foreign policy leader changes their mind, it's that the coalition supporting the foreign policy leader gets rid of that foreign policy leader. There is a regime change, and then the new regime is able to negotiate a way out. And then finally, in another scenario, it's not that the ruling regime changes their mind, it's that the ruling regime winds up being destabilized because of the economic sanctions. And then there is a revolution that winds up overthrowing them. Generally speaking, the literature is relatively clear on what the conditions are for sanctions to succeed. And I want to be very clear when I say this, that I'm making a probabilistic statement. That if a set of economic sanctions that has all of these criteria is more likely to work. That doesn't mean it is guaranteed to work. And similarly, there are sanctions that might not meet many of these criteria that wind up working as well. In some ways, it's like baseball. It's the difference between, putting up, Shohei Ohtani at bat as opposed to, let's say, any current member of the Boston Red Sox, which is just a woeful offense this year, and it's very embarrassing as a Red Sox fan. But nonetheless, the conditions for success, first, and this is almost banal to say, but it does bear repeating, is that in order for sanctions to succeed, you actually have to have a clear demand. You have to make it clear to the target state what they have to do in order for the sanctions to be lifted. Because if you are not clear what is to be done, then the target regime will view the sanctions as inexorable, and that there is nothing they can do to cause them to be lifted, and therefore there is no coercive bargaining, because the target simply does not believe that the sender is sincere in terms of lifting the sanctions. Second, obviously, the sanctions need to impose costs not just on the target population, but also on the target elite. Most nation states are capable of shifting the cost of economic sanctions onto the most vulnerable parts of the population. So you need to make sure that it's not just disenfranchised citizens who suffer from the sanctions, but also those close to the target leadership. Third, ideally, you need institutional support, because even if you ensure multilateral cooperation, you also want to make sure that those actors are all on the same page. That usually requires some degree of institutional support so that actors can stay on the same page in terms of dealing with the target state. You also need to make sure there is no black knight. There is no actor willing to step in to substitute for the economic exchange that is cut off as a result of the economic sanctions. So the classic example here would be the Soviet Union acting as a black knight with Cuba after the United States imposed sanctions on that country. And you know, more recently, potentially, you could see China as possibly acting like a black knight towards Russia in the current sanctions broadly. Although, to be fair, that's not really what the Chinese are doing to date. And then finally, low expectations of future conflict. Generally speaking, all else equal, if there are two enduring rivals and one is sanctioning the other, the problem is not necessarily making a concession today. The problem is that if you concede today, you are undercutting your bargaining position in the future, because you will develop the reputation of acquiescing to sanctions. And so between adversaries, sanctions are much less likely to work. Between allies, or with countries with low expectations of future conflict, the likelihood of success is higher, because the ally interprets that this is an anomaly rather than a regular occurrence. So in terms of well-defined demands, the classic example here is the sanctions that were imposed on Libya in 2002 were very clear in terms of allowing Gaddafi, if he'd given up his weapons of mass destruction, he would still be allowed to exist. As I will talk about in a second, Saddam Hussein did not face a similar sort of guarantee. And then in terms of high cost to the target elite, as I said before, you know, what you want to do, one of the ways in which you can ensure that the target elite pays a high price is through ensuring multilateral cooperation, through sanctioning financial chains as well as trade flows, and also trying to make sure that private sector actors bandwagon with the sanctions rather than try to undercut them. In terms of institutional support, again, you want to stop expectations of backsliding. And so institutions can permit coordination and reassurance, and furthermore, technical training in terms of how to implement the sanctions. And then in terms of black knights, another example would be when Saudi Arabia imposed sanctions on Qatar in 2017, both Iran and Turkey were willing to act as black knights to make up for lost revenue from the GCC. Skip the slide. That I will point out that when black knights do intervene, one of the effects of that is that very often the black knight winds up with an even stronger economic relationship with the targeted actor than existed prior to the sanctions being imposed. And this is obviously likelier in a bipolar or multipolar world. One of the reasons I think the United States was so enthusiastic about sanctions during the post-Cold War era was that it did not seem like any other country could act as a black knight. And then in terms of conflict expectations, a good example here was actually Vladimir Putin's use of economic coercion to prevent other states in the former Soviet Union from joining the association agreement with the European Union. Vladimir Putin Russia was able to use that threat of sanctions to prevent Armenia from making that agreement, because Armenia was a loyal ally of Russia. Moldova, on the other hand, faced immense costs as a result of those sanctions, but nonetheless agreed to the association agreement with the European Union, in no small part because they anticipated frequent clashes with Russia and therefore were willing to pay the price. And Ukraine very famously dithered in the middle until in the end they chose to, until it led to regime change there. Now, if we look at sort of the way that US sanctions in particular have evolved in one slide, the very first case of US economic sanctions was the 1807 Embargo Act that Thomas Jefferson imposed on both the United Kingdom and Napoleonic France, because both of those countries were impressing US sailors during the Napoleonic Wars. So the Jefferson administration responded by simply cutting off all trade with both Great Britain and France. This was a catastrophically stupid move. to put this in terms of modern geopolitics, this would be like Singapore voting to abolish all trade with China and the United States unless those two countries cut it out in terms of their interstate rivalry. The United States was simply not nearly powerful enough to impose any sort of economic pressure, and the sanctions lasted less than 15 months. We've now morphed, however, into a world in which the idea that the United States can use, in particular, its centrality in financial networks to weaponize that interdependence as a means of imposing coercion on other actors has grown more attractive. So you can argue that US sanctioning behavior, particularly in the last 20, 25 years, has tried to learn the lessons from what happened when the United Nations imposed sanctions on Iraq. Which is, first, those sanctions did have punishing costs, but they were also a humanitarian catastrophe in terms of leading to skyrocketing infant mortality rates within Iraq. But the key aspect of this was that Saddam Hussein's government, even though they weren't terribly competent at a lot of things, were remarkably successful at shifting the blame for the sanctions from themselves to the United States, the United Kingdom, and the United Nations. And so as a result, the United States paid a very high political price for imposing these sanctions, and yet at the time they were viewed as a failure because the Hussein regime refused to acknowledge whether or not they had a weapons of mass destruction program. And as the 90s moved to the 2000s, there was legitimate fear that the United Nations coalition was going to collapse, that France, China, and Russia had signed agreements with Iraq on energy once the sanctions were going to go away. And so as a result, the Bush administration wound up deciding to invade rather than to rely on sanctions. This represents a classic failure in that the sanctions were a net lose-lose outcome for everyone. So weaponized interdependence, which begins to sort of, occur with sanctions beginning in the 2000s with the U.S. anti-money laundering campaign, increases their, the U.S. appetite for it. Because if you decide to sanction financial networks or cut countries off from SWIFT or other, key global financial networks through access to the dollar, this undeniably hurts target elites because it hurts those actors that actually have bank accounts. There is less need for cooperation. The Iran case demonstrates that even though the European Union bitterly opposed the Trump administration's reimposition of sanctions, the Trump administration was able to nonetheless do so unilaterally, despite that opposition. Furthermore, financial sanctions, in contrast to trade sanctions, have a private sector amplifying effect. Because essentially, because reputation is so important within the financial sector, what you have is a lot of financial firms that engage in excessive de-risking. That if a sanction is imposed on a country, many actors will immediately cease and desist engaging in economic exchange, even if that exchange was legal, because they simply don't want to run afoul even close to the sanctions. And because the dollar is central to global financial networks, there are no black knights. And so in some ways, these sanctions are far more potent. They can impose costs. They can impose costs on the target elite. The need for cooperation is fewer or is less. You can see why the United States is enthusiastic about this. And indeed, there's been bipartisan enthusiasm for this. Both the Obama administration and then subsequently the Trump administration were very enthusiastic about the power of sanctions to be able to compel actors into making concessions. The problem is that weaponized interdependence, while undeniably enhancing the potency of the sanctions, can't fix other pathologies that have marked U.S. sanctioning behavior. They can't stop excessive ambitions. They can't stop the United States from imposing sanctions and making either inchoate demands or demands that are so extravagant that no target would ever agree to them. Furthermore, even if the sanctions are costly, expectations of future conflict, if they are high, will still impose a dramatic constraint on the target state's willingness to make any concessions. And perhaps most important, in order for coercive bargaining to occur, a country has to, make two kinds of credible commitment with sanctions. First, they have to commit that sanctions will be imposed if the target doesn't meet its conditions, but also they have to credibly commit that the sanctions will be lifted if the target actually acquiesces. And increasingly, it seems like the United States cannot make that second credible commitment. And so this leads to the failure of the Iran sanctions, the Trump administration's reimposition of them. There was no denying that there was maximum pressure put on. There were punishing costs. The problem is that the demands associated with those sanctions were, to use a political science term, ridiculous. Secretary of State Pompeo at the time gave a speech outlining what Iran would have to do to comply with the sanctions. There were 12 demands. Most of them actually had nothing to do with nuclear proliferation or Iran's nuclear program. And even Pompeo, as he read the list, acknowledged that it was a long list. So the sanctions did impose humanitarian costs on Iran and did lead to protests and unrest in Iran, giving the Trump administration hope that there would be regime change. This has failed to happen, however, and indeed, Iran, of course, accelerated its nuclear program, creating an additional problem. And indeed, even the Trump administration, by the time they used the Soleimani strike, was acknowledging that there was a problem. So in order to talk about sanctioning great powers, I just want to say that great powers are usually able and willing to resist sanctions without question the best. They're usually going to have the deepest capabilities to do so. The idea that sanctions alone will stop Russia from its military operations in Ukraine is largely foolhardy. And the fact that sanctions failed as a form of deterrence should suggest that. That said, it should be noted that sanctions are going to be relatively important in terms of affecting Russia's ability to prosecute the war going forward. And in that sense, you need to think of sanctions not so much as the primary tool to pressure Russia, but rather as an adjunct to Ukraine's success on the battlefield. And then I will close by pointing out that in some ways, the sanctions we're seeing against Russia evoke prior, examples of sanctions, but none of that we would consider recent. We can either think about the Agadir crisis in 1911, which helped, force Germany to back down when they tried to intervene in Morocco. But Germany learned the lesson from that and wound up making sure that they had sufficient reserves to start World War I. The League of Nations, when they sanctioned Italy, when Italy invaded Ethiopia, the sanctions are widely viewed as a failure, but they actually came close to succeeding. The US oil embargo on Japan right before World War II was in some ways the sanction that should cause everyone some consternation, because in the end, Japan, attacks Pearl Harbor in no small part because they decided that they had no other choice, that even though they were unlikely to win a military conflict, the cost of the sanctions were so prohibitively high for Japan's economy that they were viewed as having no other choice. And so the disturbing question to ask is whether this is how Russia will view the allied, the sort of US-led economic sanctions against Russia as Russia's economy begins to falter, which is going to happen over time as it loses the ability to manufacture anything. And I will leave it there and end the screen share. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very excellent, very comprehensive, and very easy to understand. So our discussant, Masako Spinohara, will make some comments and she'll ask some questions. Okay, Masako, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you very much for letting me join. Professor Drezner, thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. And it's a great honor for me because as a student of international political economy, you have been my hero for decades. Okay. On economic sanctions, it seems that the more we learn about the topic, the more pessimistic we become on the future of international politics. And there are some kind of advices to make economic sanctions more effective in today's presentation. I'd like to make some comments on this point, and because I'd like to hear Professor Dan's comments on this. And then if time allows, I'd also like to talk a bit about the Japan situation concerning economic statecraft and economic sanctions. Okay, first, how to make economic sanctions more effective. Professor Drezner have made a sensible list on this. And the reason we become more pessimistic when we think of sanction policies of the United States is that the political atmosphere in the United States is now there's great bipartisan support for economic sanctions against Russia, less so with Iran, but politicians and maybe the public also support imposing greater sanctions on bad guys in the international politics. But it's not just limited to particular behavior of certain actors, like nuclear programs in Iran and invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It's also tied to many humanitarian issues. And it makes, well, as Professor Drezner pointed out very clearly, it's become really difficult to lift sanctions in some sense because just stopping mass killing in Russia might not be enough for the United States to stop sanctions. But as the presentation clearly made a point, then it's more difficult for the United States to make a kind of credible commitment. Well, and so that's one of the points. And on targeted sanctions, well, the effectiveness, well, targeted sanctions might be better because it inflicts less pains on the ordinary people, the weak ones, and it might work. But when we look back at cases of North Korea or Russia, at least in the short run, target sanctions might not be that effective to get a quick change of behavior on the side of political elites on nasty countries. That's another concern. Well, even in unlikely situations, sort of black nights come out, and elites cannot easily change their minds because, for one thing, they do not want to back down under the pressure from foreign countries. And so I'd like to ask your comments on these points. And other thing, well, one of the impressive point I got from your foreign affairs article published last year is that in international politics, there's always a need to negotiate with nasty actors. And as I mentioned earlier, in the political atmosphere, especially in the United States, but also elsewhere in other parts of the world, with such an atmosphere to kind of ideological or normative aspiration to punish bad guys, it's really difficult to negotiate with nasty guys. And that makes things more complicated when policymakers might think that sanctions should be one of the policy options that should be combined with other means, including diplomacy. But when people support sanctions enthusiastically, it becomes more difficult, not just to lift sanctions, but also to negotiate with the other side. That's another point. And okay, I think I still have time. Let me say some things about the situation of Japan, and I'd like to hear the thought of Professor Drezner on this point. Well, this is not limited to Japan, of course, but now we are facing a multi-front situation. It's not just Russia, it's not just China, and we cannot divide the world into two, just like we did in that era of Cold War. So the situation is really complex. And when it comes to sanctions in a multi-front situation, what can policymakers do? What can great powers in the world politics do? Well, Japan's kind of middle power rather than great power, I would say. But in the case of Russia, one of the biggest challenge for Japan is to what to do with Japan's stakes in the Sakhalin oil and gas projects. Well, in order to punish Russia effectively, Japan should stop buying oil and gas from those places. But Japanese government say by doing so, the stake might easily go to China, which would benefit another potential rival in the future. So in such a situation, it's very difficult to set clear goals because there are some conflicting goals to deal with a couple of different, I'd say enemies. That's quote unquote enemies. Okay, and right now in Japan, there's a bill called Economic Security Promotion Bill, which is likely to be passed today, just today. And it's more on the defensive side. Japan wants to make its economy more resilient to economic sanctions, possible economic sanctions. Mainly, I think it's due to Japan's experience with Chinese sanction back in 2010. And if we apply your argument to countries on the defensive side, I'm not talking about Russia or Iran, but if you give some advice to Japan, what would you do? Once you say that sanctions against allies are more effective than sanctions against enemies, I hope you would not recommend the American government to sanction Japan. Let's say, what would you do? Well, Japan relies more on China than the United States do. And in such a situation, there are a lot of dilemmas Japan has to deal with. What would you advise to Japanese policymakers on this point? Well, actually, I do want to ask a lot more, but because of time constraint, let me stop here. I think the audience have a lot of other questions.
Thank you very much, Masako. And Dan, do you want to respond to what she has said? Or do you want to wait until we...
It's up to you. I can respond quickly now, or would you rather I take other questions?
Okay, why don't you say just a few words and then we'll...
Sure. First of all, thank you to Professor Suganohara for such clear comments. I would add a few things. Just first, you raise a valid point, and this is something I didn't say in the talk, but it is something that I think is interesting with respect to the sanctions against Russia, which is that public opinion does play a role here. Not so much in not just in terms of what the government has done, but I think the most fascinating aspect of the sanctions against Russia has not been anything that the US government or any other government has done. I think the sanctions against the Russian central bank are somewhat interesting, and that's a separate conversation. But honestly, the most interesting thing about the sanctions against Russia has been the voluntary actions by corporations to pull out of Russia. I think primarily due to consumer, employer, and shareholder pressure. And so that is interesting. We haven't seen anything quite on that scale before. And the fact that you've actually seen that, and it seems to be lasting, is indicative of something that I think is new in terms of sanctioning. I think does prompt further research. I tend to agree with the point about targeted sanctions, that they tend to be less effective. And also, I think targeted sanctions, the way I put it is that targeted sanctions are almost viewed as precision-guided munitions, and that they can presumably hit the target with minimal collateral damage. And much like precision-guided munitions, that tends not to actually be the case. That there is still a significant collateral damage. And it is funny how targeted sanctions are often imposed on countries that already have other sanctions to deal with as well. In terms of what my advice for Japan, I do think that the bill, in terms of being able to defend against Chinese economic pressure, absolutely makes sense, and that unfortunately, the more Japan views China as a rival, the less likely Chinese pressure on Japan is going to work. The other obvious recommendation, and this is easy for me as an American to make, is to suggest that Japan needs to repair ties with South Korea, because South Korea is the other country that is most likely to be the target of Chinese economic coercion. And surely if South Korea and Japan cooperate, both in terms of dealing with North Korea, but also in terms of dealing with China, it puts both countries on a stronger strategic footing.
Okay, thank you very much. So in the meantime, we have received some questions from the audience. So I'll just read a few at a time, and then
Sure.
you can respond, and then we'll go on to the next round. Okay. First, one person says, how do you predict the possible consequences of the ongoing Russia's case? Do you think a regime change is possible, and in what ways? It's not likely that economic sanctions will lead to, is it not likely that the economic sanctions will lead to more aggressive action by Russia, for instance, because Putin or future leaders may want to disrupt the domestic audience from economic deterioration? Okay.
Do you want me to answer? Or do you want me to
Okay,
wait?
sure.
So predicting regime change in Russia is not a it's a foolhardy enterprise. There are many ways in which Putin seems to be in control. Let me put it this way: I don't think the sanctions alone are going to lead to regime change, but you can argue that Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. The one thing that is very clear. I'm co-director of the Russian Eurasia program at the Fletcher School, and based on my own interactions, Russia's elite thinks this is a catastrophic mistake, and there is very little support at the elite level for this action. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean much, because a lot of these people are extremely scared of Vladimir Putin and don't want to run crossways on him. But that said, the longer this war drags on, and the less things like Russian planes are able to fly and Russia's able to manufacture goods, because literally even on its defense equipment, it is in desperate need of component parts from outside Russia. It is going to lead to rising levels of economic discontent. I don't think that's necessarily, leads to more aggressive action by Russia. To be blunt, I'm not sure Russia has much more force that it can launch at this point. And what's more noteworthy to me is not so much what Russia has done in Ukraine, but what Russia keeps threatening to do and yet doesn't do, in terms of taking actions in Moldova or taking actions on arms shipments. And if it keeps making those threats and not carrying them out, then those threats don't wind up amounting to much.
Okay, thank you very much. So a person from the Iranian embassy wants to know whether or not Iran under sanctions is going to be even more powerful.
No. It's not going to be less powerful either. I mean, Iran's economy has suffered significantly as a result of the sanctions. If you take a look at the rial's value in relation to other currencies, if you look at the domestic unrest within Iran, Iran's economy has not thrived with the sanctions imposition. Now, that said, does Iran have, a more active nuclear program now? Of course, absolutely. And so in that respect, it does represent a greater threat to the region. I'm not sure I would describe that as therefore more powerful. It's more threatening.
Okay, thank you. What logic can explain the legitimacy of sanctions to domestic stakeholders, given the difficulty in evaluation of the effectiveness, especially when sanctions are prolonged? What kind of communication should the country imposing the sanctions make to domestic audience, stakeholders?
Well, I think a few things. This is where I think the sanctions against Russia really do genuinely represent an anomaly, because these sanctions are imposing costs on the United States, on Japan, on the European Union, most obviously in the form of elevated energy prices, but also elevated food prices. The truth is, though, most sanctions regimes don't impose significant costs on most sanctioning countries. And so very often this sort of articulation is not necessary, because domestic stakeholders don't feel that much in the way of pain. And when they, when this does happen, very often it's domestic stakeholders that are actually lobbying for the sanctions in the first place. And also, one of the reasons these are often given is, as I said before, the enforcement of certain norms within the liberal international order, including nuclear nonproliferation, protection of human rights, violations of Westphalian sovereignty, and so forth.
Okay, thank you very much. Not read this very well. Speaking of the situation in Ukraine, some scholars point out the nationalistic aspect of Putin and his regime. To what extent do you think economic sanctions work on such cases that seem to work outside of the quote unquote rationalist framework?
Oh, and he also asked a question about how China's economic sanctions are different. In terms of Russia, I mean, it is true that in some ways, when the United States and European Union imposed sanctions on Russia in 2014, when Putin annexed the Crimea and took actions in the Donbass, one of Russia's responses was to actually impose even more costly sanctions to Russia, which is it imposed an agricultural embargo from the European Union. And there are ways, and this goes back to research by Johan Galtung, that target leaders can sometimes use sanctions as a way to bolster their own regime and undercut those interest groups that have an incentive in international trade. And that is what happened in Russia. I can say the only positive upside of that for Russia was that farm-to-table restaurants in Moscow thrived as a result of the sanctions. In terms of China's economic statecraft being different, I would say that China's economic statecraft is different from the United States in at least one key way, which is, generally speaking, when the United States threatens and or imposes economic sanctions, they're very upfront about it. It says, we are imposing economic sanctions, or we will impose economic sanctions. Sometimes the demands aren't clear, but the act of sanctioning is clear. China, on the other hand, is the best term I could use to describe China on this is passive aggressive, which is to say that they sometimes do impose sanctions, but then deny that they are imposing sanctions. This is, in fact, what they did in 2010 in the dispute with Japan over the Senkaku Islands. And so it does make it a little odd, because if they deny that they're sanctioning in the first place, that also makes it difficult to engage in coercive bargaining sometimes. But it also means that sometimes China threatens to do things and then fails to follow through.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are running out of time, so let me just confine ourselves to answering one more question.
Sure.
So this is in Japanese, so I'll read it in Japanese, but the translator will translate it for you, or I may translate it at the end. In
implementing economic sanctions, in order to prevent the loophole of the sanctions, Black Knight or someone that could be the Black Knight, how they could be convinced or talked out of doing that.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. And I think the most obvious, to concretize this, in some ways, we're kind of looking at China right now with respect to Russia. China does have the capacity to act as a Black Knight for the sanctions against Russia. The question is, will they? And I think the answer here is that in one of the advantages of the U.S.'s ability, of the centrality of the dollar and the centrality of U.S. capital markets, is that I think the U.S. is able at this point to deter China from acting like a Black Knight. China's government has said many things like, we're not going to honor the sanctions or what have you. But if you take a look at Chinese banks, including the AIIB, by the way, they are honoring the sanctions because they don't want to run afoul of U.S. Treasury. So at least on the financial side of things, it does seem as though, that does deter Black Knight behavior. But it's only if the sanctions are imposed through finance. If it's through trade, it is very difficult to stop a Black Knight from intervening.
Okay. Sorry, but one more question from
Okay.
our fellow researcher. If China were to invade Taiwan, would the West be able to impose the kind of comprehensive sanctions on China, the likes that they're imposing against Russia?
I am skeptical. Russia is an important player in global energy markets and in global commodities markets, but in the end, its economy is smaller than the Netherlands. It is not a crucial actor in global supply chains. That does not describe China. China is a significant player. It is a large market, and it is absolutely central to global supply chains. So one of the things that would not happen, which has happened in the case of Russia, is multinational corporations voluntarily withdrawing from China. So let me put it this way. If China were to invade Taiwan now, there is no way that the response would be as similar. One of the interesting things going forward, however, is whether you are going to see Western multinationals reevaluate global supply chains, particularly with respect to China. This has something to do with geopolitics, but also I would add this has to do with the way China's zero COVID policy is also, proving to be a tremendous hindrance in terms of global supply chains. And that has nothing to do with international relations. And I do wonder at what point, multinationals start to reassess sourcing key elements of their global supply chain from China.
Okay, thank you very much. All clear, very, very clear. Okay, so let me just thank you for your excellent talk, and also Masako for her comments.
Thank you, Masako.
And my thanks go to the translators for their excellent work. And thank you for your patience. We could not answer all your questions, but we had a very good discussion. Okay, so thank you very, very much for your participation, and please join me in giving a big hand to our speakers.
Thank you. And thank you to the interpreter. I apologize if I spoke too quickly.
Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much.